There is a relationship between the United States and Napoleon.
But I really kind of want to get into the Napoleonic Wars
Sure.
because I know that you and I, we've talked a little bit about the Napoleonic Wars, and there were some really important things that came out of the Napoleonic Wars, as horrible as they were. But let's talk about that. So
Okay.
1803, 1815. What kicks this off? What kicks off the Napoleonic Wars in Europe?
Well, what kicks it off is in 1802, the British and the French concluded the Treaty of Amiens.
Mhm.
And that was the first time and the only time in 20 years that France and Britain had been at peace. It was a very uneasy peace, but peace nonetheless. When Napoleon took the throne, when he crowned himself Emperor of Europe, Emperor of France. He wanted to be Emperor of Europe,
Right.
and we'll get to that later on. But when he crowned himself Emperor of France, or Emperor of the French, on December 2nd, 1804, is when the British formed the Third Coalition against Napoleon. That's when they went to war. One of the biggest misconceptions about the Napoleonic Wars is that Napoleon started these wars. He did not. He only started one of them, which, well, technically two, but one of them was the invasion of Russia, okay, which he started, and also the invasion of Spain, the ousting of the Spanish royal family, and putting his own family on the throne and trying to occupy Spain, the Spanish ulcer, which turned into a disaster.
Yeah.
But otherwise, the Allies started these wars, and Napoleon had wanted to preserve peace, but they didn't go for it. They wanted him off the throne. And they spared no expense. There's an old saying that the British spared no expense to defeat Napoleon. They were willing to defeat Napoleon right down to the last Austrian.
Mm.
And it's funny because what that means is that the British paid the armies of Europe to fight against Napoleon. They financed, because the British really didn't have a large army at the time. When have they ever in history, right? So although the British army would play a significant role in Spain later on, and once it was paired with the Duke of Wellington, it became a force to be reckoned with. But early on, it didn't perform very well. And it wasn't very large, so the British needed to pay the Austrians and the Russians to fight Napoleon. And they did numerous times, and numerous times Napoleon won. And the old joke was about the Austrians because Napoleon had to defeat the Austrians about 4 times in his career in 4 different wars. The Austrians were like his whipping boy. And it was really sad because the Austrian army was actually not that bad, but he made such cruel work of them. It's unbelievable.
But okay, so this is an American history page. I am historically okay. So we've got to talk a little bit about
that. Yes.
We've got to talk a little bit about the Louisiana Purchase.
Yes.
Was that the Louisiana Purchase? Was that true that Napoleon sold it in order to finance the Napoleonic Wars?
No.
So why? How did that deal come about? Why did Napoleon decide to give up such a large swath of land to the Americans?
Okay. So Napoleon gave up Louisiana and sold it to the United States. I think it was for $15 million, which is probably the greatest steal in American history. Okay. Yeah. Because Napoleon realized that he could not defend it against the British. The French did not have the resources. They didn't have the army to send overseas. They didn't have a large enough navy, because the French navy was really purged of all its good officers during the Revolution. So while it had excellent warship, it didn't have excellent crews and excellent captains. So there's no way it could compete with the Royal Navy, especially in 1803.
Yeah.
So recognizing this, Napoleon, as a shrewd politician he was, said, okay, well, let's sell it to the U.S. And the U.S. gets this great swath of territory, and he no longer has to spend any money or spare any anxiety of defending a French colonial empire, which he originally wanted to do. That's why he had the Louisiana originally. They acquired it from Spain, and he wanted to create a North American empire. But he realized it wasn't possible because of the British, and with the creation of the United States, they would have the upper hand in any type of conflict in North America. So that's the truth behind the Louisiana Purchase. Did he, want to use the money for the financing of the Napoleonic Wars? No. He wanted to use the money for financing, whatever else was going on in France. And he utilized it really to finance the army, just to upkeep the army for its coming campaign against the invasion of England, the proposed invasion of England in 1805. So, and that's where we start getting into the wars itself.
Yeah.
But let's talk about the United States again.
Yeah.
Okay, because this is something that isn't really mentioned in history book, and you go through high school, you might not ever hear about this, but Napoleon and the United States had a very good relationship. Okay, Napoleon and the U.S. were allied to each other. The U.S. was Napoleon's ally, and much of this was because of Anglophobia. Of course, it was right after the American Revolution, and much of the American public was like, "We don't want to, have anything to do with the British."
Yeah.
Still Francophiles, French helped us and everything. Well, it wasn't the same France anymore. And the U.S. government even turned around and said, we don't have to pay you back, because we owe the French monarchy money. We don't owe Napoleon money and the Republic money. We owe the Bourbon monarchy money. So they said, no, we're not going to pay our debt back. But Napoleon saw them as a useful ally in North America. And here's where we get into the Russian campaign, okay? Yeah. Now, I'm going to go back real quick to President Madison, okay? This is where we tie in Napoleon with Madison. Napoleon had this plan if it came to invading Russia, because the original idea was not to invade Russia. It was just to mass an army along the Russian-Polish border to compel Emperor Alexander, okay, to conform to the continental system, which was an economic blockade of Great Britain. As early as 1810, because it was crippling the Russian economy, Alexander I pulled his country out of the continental system because he was still Napoleon's ally, and which we didn't go through, but Alexander I and Russia was Napoleon's ally after 1807. So to try to compel him to re-enter this blockade against Great Britain, the economic blockade, he amassed his army. When Alexander said no, the Russian army withdrew from the border, and Napoleon decided, well, let's go after him, okay? We need a decisive battle. So then it becomes a campaign. So his army moves into Russia. The Russians refuse battle. They retire. They fight a small rearguard action, small skirmishes here and there, but there wasn't that one decisive battle that Napoleon needed that he believed would end the war in one fell stroke. Not until the Battle of Smolensk, and he believed that the Battle of Smolensk was going to be that battle, but it wasn't. The Russian army escaped again, okay? Eventually, they ended up at the Battle of Borodino in September of 1812, September 7th. The bloodiest day of the Napoleonic Wars. Over 75,000 men were killed, not just wounded, but killed during that battle. And it was a Pyrrhic Napoleonic victory, but a lot of historians, including myself, criticize Napoleon because he refused to activate the Imperial Guard during the battle. And if he had, it's a possibility he could have decisively defeated the Russian army on the field that day and broke their morale, and Alexander would have sued for peace. But instead, Marshal Kutuzov, who was in charge of the Russian army, withdrew the Russian army in good order, and instead of defending the capital directly, they left the capital. Well, Napoleon and his army reached the capital, okay, in late September, and the Russians don't surrender. And the rest is history, the horrific withdrawal from Russia. And the Grande Armée disintegrated from over 500,000 to less than 40,000 when he recrosses the Berezina River into Poland.
Oh my gosh.
And how do you recover from that, right? How do you recover from that?
What a devastating loss.
It really was. But you know what? Napoleon does recover from it. He develops another army. Okay, he builds another army of 250,000 men, and now he's got to stop the Russians. And Alexander I becomes like the hero now, the hero of continental Europe, who sees Napoleon as the existential threat. They need to defeat him. And so he leads the coalition effort on the continent, whereas the British are leading the effort in Spain under the Duke of Wellington, who hasn't even entered the discussion yet, who becomes an important figure later on.
Yeah.
But Napoleon falls back, of course, to Germany. You have the Battle of Nations, the Battle of Leipzig, which the anniversary was a few days ago. Napoleon goes back to France. He fights a very skillful campaign in France in 1814. The Allies just simply overwhelm him, and he's forced to abdicate the throne. If you've seen the movie Waterloo in 1970, it gives a good representation of the series of events that took place for that to happen.
Yeah.
So he abdicates the throne, and that's his descent from power initially, where he's exiled to the island of Elba.
There's no hope, sir. We have defeated, sire.
20 years we've got it.
So Napoleon's meteoric rise was a meteoric fall from power as well. So it occurred within a span of just 2 years.
Yeah.
Where he was at the pinnacle of his power, and then he's at exile.
Yeah.
So he had it from two different directions, from Spain and then Russia. And then what turned out not to be an invasion became an invasion that was an own undoing. Now, getting back to James Madison, I kind of veered away from that. Napoleon discussed the invasion of Russia with Madison personally through letters for about 2 years, because he had this planned well in advance. And he wanted to coordinate.
Okay, wait a second. At this time, is John Quincy the ambassador?
John Quincy was the ambassador, yes.
In Russia? Okay, so
he did not go through him.
Okay, so he was cut out of any of that.
Any of it.
Okay.
Anything. This didn't become known until I think the 1950s, where they actually found in the presidential library letters from Napoleon Bonaparte to James Madison. And this was done through secret correspondence. How they achieved it is really not known so much. They only mentioned it briefly, where Napoleon had special envoys that posed as British traders, and they would enter the U.S., and that's how he got through the Royal Navy. But their correspondence, they wanted the United States to occupy the British on the North American continent and secure Napoleon's Baltic flank from the British Navy as he entered Russia. And this was coordinated almost to perfection, because the invasion of Russia began only a few days before the United States declared war on Great Britain. So the timing of this was impeccable.
Yeah.
Despite no communication. I mean, how do you determine that? And it was done almost to the day, and it didn't work out really for either side. But that's the link between James Madison and Napoleon that you will not see in most history books.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting.
Even any of them.